Okay, so I just watched Christopher Ray go ahead and address, the expiration and renewal argument when it comes down to Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, 702. Alright, to be blunt, that, it may be repeatedly renewed by every administration. It being ethical, on the other hand, and constitutional, whole other story. All right. So, what most people don't realize is yes, to go ahead and attempt to prevent terrorist attacks. All right. Ultimately, it's easier when there's somebody that pops up, on a potential federal threat watch list, that there's intentional vagueness to the reason that ended up happening. All right? Keep in mind, there have literally been people that just because of the factor that they ended up, for example, trying to start a relationship with somebody in the military that ended up feeling scorned in the end, ends up going ahead and be like, you know what? Fuck my ex. I'm throwing that motherfucker on an FBI watch list. I do not give a fuck. It has been utilized in that manner before. All right? Not to mention that. But ultimately, that whole concept of, being able to, without a search warrant, go ahead and attempt to mitigate a terrorist attack. Let's go ahead and clarify something. It would be more believable if it wasn't used as a sledgehammer for systemic oppression. All right? If it hadn't literally been weaponized to go ahead and swat people and dox people and go, literally in an attempt to go and try to manipulate, in a certain situation that they got going on. All right? Literally, when, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, 702, ends up going ahead and being used as a weapon and leverage for extortion to go ahead and try to manipulate the direction that and trajectory that people are capable of even going or living their lives, that's a problem. When you literally have people on that FBI watch list that 702 gets weaponized against, that, if it was asked, reason for being on the list, activist, protester, that's a fucking problem, especially when you go ahead and try to, not tell people, oh, by the way, for the sake of saying, potential domestic terror threat, ultimately, warrantless access to your devices remotely, that will end up going ahead and being the standard because, we're spying on you because, America, want things to be safe. That is a intentional fucking problem. And the funny thing is, that fucking problem with people being short-sighted don't understand that problem actually ends up being the tool that could give leverage to go ahead and blackmail and extort politicians that end up going ahead and being the lawmakers. So, ultimately, remember, lawmakers, you are literally putting the proverbial shotgun right to your forehead and pulling the trigger yourself. And ultimately, you could stand out of your own way and understand when it comes down to the older people in the government. I'm sorry, but there are a lot that don't end up going ahead and retiring, end up, being on some form of medication, because they're reaching the point of, cognitive deterioration. Like, you need to stand aside and stop trying to slow walk progress, you know? Especially when people are trying to get progress in a safe trajectory. So ultimately, it is really, especially with the FBI's track record, it is really starting to look like Russia and Ukraine, as well as Palestine and Israel, and, basically the withholding of, humanitarian aid is really being weaponized as a smokescreen to go ahead and try to deflect attention away from the importance of not making warrantless surveillance the standard, all right? Because when you do that, you are militarizing law enforcement, all right? They will use that. They will militia up. We've seen it before. We see the amount of damage that's being done because of that whole street cop seminar training, the amount of brutality, abuse of power, suppression of civil liberty. It is happening on a day-to-day basis at this point. And ultimately, that piece of legislation right there, regardless of the factor that every president, since Bush, ended up going ahead and authorizing it and reauthorizing it, because I think it is mitigated. It was reported, it hasn't even mitigated a total of 30 terrorist attacks, all right? Because understand, mass shootings, school shootings, shooting up a grocery store, something like that, those don't get categorized as a terrorist attack. Those get categorized by law enforcement as a mass casualty situation. Splitting the hairs on that detail right there, that is not a fucking detail you could split hairs. That is one that you have to take accountability as a whole. Because with that, that's ultimately saying, yeah, we just want to go ahead and be able to, spy on taxpayers, spy on politicians, spy on, people that work within federal jobs, spy on anyone and everyone. If you have electronic devices and everything, we could pop in. You don't even know that we're watching you. Well, literally, trying to claim that piece of legislation is to prevent terrorist attacks while simultaneously in omitting the detail that mass shootings get categorized and classified as mass casualty situations, not terrorist attacks, mass casualty situations, which literally makes it fucking needless to go ahead and have warrantless surveillance in an attempt to mitigate terrorist attacks. And if it works, understand, you need to have the biggest fucking nudge to be able to pull that hypothesis out of your ass without having to explain why that classified difference